So on to tonight's expert. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the wonderful Clair Warner, who is Head of Service at Newbridge Outreach in Redbridge, specialising in supporting pupils who have difficulties associated with medical needs, physical disabilities, gross and fine motor skills, dyspraxia and other organisational and learning difficulties. She's also an amazingly inspiring person who has been instrumental in ensuring my son Jude's time at school has been an extremely happy one. I feel incredibly lucky to have her on Jude's team and extremely excited and proud to be able to share her with you this evening. Over to you, Claire.
Hi, thanks, Sam. I always feel a bit overwhelmed when Sam introduces me because I'm just generally doing my job. So this is the second webinar I've done for the charity, and it's meant to be a collection of ideas and information. And as Sam said, it's meant to be very informal. So if, as I'm rambling on, as I'm prone to, that you want to ask anything, just stop me, put the message in the chat, and just stop me and we can address each issue as it comes up. I spoke at last year's conference, and during the COVID time, it's an unusual time to do talks because normally you know what you're talking about. I can talk about EHCs or I can talk about different forms of activities for school because it's something that you've tried and tested and I'm able to tell you, yes, do this or don't do that. And, you know, professionals along with parents are learning as we go. We're also quite good at getting used to information changes being dropped by the government at 5 o'clock on a Friday night. That seems to be the peak time that changes are dropped. So we now look for that and we're getting ready. So I've put together a presentation, and hopefully if Sam and I have done all the wizardry, it should work. So I'm just going to see if I share. Sam, can you let me know if you can see that? Can you see that, Sam?
I can't yet, no.
Okay. Any joy?
Not yet.
Okay, I will try something different. So let's have a look. I'll come back and then try this one. And then try that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, that's fine. So I will just start this off. Okay, so I've just done a few slides. They're really just as prompts for me. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I'm quite prone to rambling, so I'll try and be as succinct as possible. So just so Sam's introduced me, but just to let you know what I generally do, my passion is really around supporting students who have complex medical and physical. I'm slightly rogue as an LEA person in that I'm generally known for coming up with a plan that is not normally very typical. I sort of spend my life trying to look at individual solutions to individual problems. I'm also PD ambassador for the UK, so if any of your children's settings don't belong to something called PDNet, I would definitely get them to join. There's loads of really good information for schools and colleges for children with physical disabilities. I do a range of things, and then just for context for my own life, I have a daughter who, even though I've done this all my career, also has very complex medical and vision difficulties, who has just left school. So I am now a free mum with no more school visits, which is quite a strange feeling. So that's who I am. Now, in terms of thinking about going back to school, I think probably as families, you're going to either be in one camp or the other. I think either you're going to be thinking, at last, I have a little bit of freedom to myself and I have some time. But certainly talking to most of my medical and physical families, most of them are more in the camp of being very anxious. From, you know, we've been told to shield all this time and suddenly shielding isn't a thing anymore and they can go back to school. How does that work? So if you're in the camp with the cheering dad where you think all's good, that's great. We've got some ideas for you. But if you're anxious, I was just going to explain to you as a group about what schools and colleges would do before allowing your child to come back. And I think it's something that most families don't really understand what would happen before a start for a child to go back to school or college. So we're going to look at really what the current government position is. So I did some research this morning, and certainly at the moment I can't find any change of information since the middle of August. That's probably because most of the politicians are on holiday. But generally the standpoint is the same as the beginning of August, and there is the expectation for people to go back to school and college. Then we're going to look at the impact of a medical opinion and what that means and why that's important. And then I'm going to explain about whether it be a college, a nursery or a school, for the students that you have, they will all need to do a risk assessment if they haven't done one already. I'm hoping by the end of this evening that what you'll end up with is a collection of questions to ask your school or setting before your young person goes back to school. Because I think it's really important you understand what's gone on, and that will help hopefully you be able to make a decision about whether or not they go back to school. And then as normal, there's just some general advice and practical ideas about what to do and how to make it a little bit smoother. So in terms of where we're at legally, all students are expected to return to school in September. Those students that have EHCs and they have outcomes on the EHCs, there is still this overriding umbrella about the outcomes are to be delivered as reasonably as possible. So that means schools and settings have to do their best they can, but it may be there's elements of an EHC that might still not be able to be delivered because of contact, etc. A fairly new rule that's come in for September is any intervention, whether that be physiotherapy, speech, whatever that children go out for or young people go out for, they can only go out for 15 minutes. They can only be with another practitioner one-to-one for 15 minutes, which I thought was quite interesting because lots of my students have interventions that last longer than 15 minutes. And then the government current advice to schools is that TAs need to stand 2 meters away where possible. Again, that's fairly interesting advice. I think if you're just supporting somebody that has dyslexia or something like that, you could step away and then just get involved when you need to. Certainly lots of my students need a lot of physical help. And I have a lot that have behavioural and quite challenging issues, so they would need, TA couldn't be 2 meters away. So that's the current advice that your school or college will be receiving, unless it changes between now and next week. So they also have added at the beginning of August 2 new sections. Now the new sections that relate to you as families are, they've added a new statement that says settings can request medical evidence before readmitting a student back to school. And the second thing that's relevant to you is that vulnerable students attend only if the risk assessment deems they can be supported safely in school. So there are 2 things that we're going to pull apart a little bit so you understand what they mean, but they're 2 relatively new changes during the summer holidays, and they're very relevant to your children. Does that all make sense? Okay, so just to explain what a school and college would need to do before your child can go back to the setting. They have to do something that's called a risk assessment. And obviously risk assessments existed in lots of different shapes and forms. You'll have a whole school risk assessment about the environment. You'll have a risk assessment about everything possible. But when COVID came, children that have individual needs and special needs, you have to do a risk assessment based on those needs. So if a child has SEN or they have complex health needs or both, they should have an individual risk assessment that's held by the school or the college. And what they have to do is list all the risks that are apparent for that young person. And then they have to put in the next column what they could do as a school to mitigate that risk. And then ultimately they have to work out, are they able to keep them safe, or would they still be safer at home? And even though you hear on the news about going back to school, everybody has to go back to school, the children that we're talking about tonight, that will be after this risk assessment has happened. So it could still be, in some settings, it is still deemed safer for them to be at home, which is probably something that's not shared on the general news. So if it's deemed, so say your medical team says it's still not safe for them to go back to school, and schools can't do things to mitigate the risk, that's where it's very important for the homes to let the local authority know, we're going to be at home for another month or another 2 months, and what can you do to help? What they don't want is it to be this ad hoc thing it's been throughout the last COVID period of this will do, or we'll do our best, because every young person needs access to an education. So it's really important, once the risk assessment has done, for you to work out where you sit. And if you do sit in the setting where you need to still be at home, then it is really important to let the local authority know. And that the things that we were saying to families at the beginning about, you know, do your best, just, you know, look after each other. It's very much now about young people's education not being affected if you still need to be at home. So this is just an example of an element of a risk assessment that I would have for one of my dystrophy students. One of the risks, they would probably have, some of mine would have 10, 20 risks on their individual risk assessment. But this is an example of, obviously, because of their medication or underlying heart issues, they're at risk of infection. They need to have intimate care, which other students don't need to have. So first thing a school or a setting would do is ask for a medical team to say, are they fit to come back to school? My experience at the moment is most medical teams are saying, yes, go back to school, by far. And then the school would list what they would do to try and keep your child safe in that situation. So use of PPE, designated a single toilet just for them, cleaning protocol before and afterwards, limiting the number of staff that work with your child, and other things that you could do in terms of what they would need to do. So when you're deciding about whether they go back to school, I think a really good starting point is to maybe talk to the school or college about their risk assessment for your child, i.e. what does that look like in terms of where they're going to sit, cleaning protocol, do staff have PPE, because it helps you begin to formulate the level of risk, rather than you just thinking, I'm sending them back to school and I don't know, because that's where the anxiety comes from if you don't know the plans that are in place. Certainly before you all joined, I was talking to Sam, and at this moment in time, Sam doesn't know, do you, what the plan is for Jude? And that's where the anxiety comes. But I think maybe if somebody could share something like this with you, would that help in terms of what that would look like?
Absolutely, absolutely. And as well for Jude, because he's really anxious about school, what school will actually look like when he goes back. Like how will it work? How will, you know, it's simplest of things of what entrance am I going to go into? What's going to happen at lunchtime? And, you know, at lunchtime, and am I going to have the same TA or in each of my classes? Like, how's that going to work? And it's almost like the more he thinks about it, the more questions he has, where actually, you know, the idea of them. So I heard from the school today that we're going to create a video that kind of talks to students around the school and, you know, highlights any changes or what things have been put into place. And actually the idea of that really pleases him, because it's like he knows that there'll be certain things there, like hand sanitizer, and this is what I'm going to do then. And he really, like, you know, sets a scene for him and is starting to make him feel better. So I'm looking forward to getting that and showing that to him, because I think that will make a real difference.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. So I just didn't know, as a group of parents, whether you knew that this is what it looked like, and that it may not look exactly those colours and that format, but it will have that information. So it's certainly something that if you are anxious or you haven't made your mind up yet, it's something that you could ask to see, talk to the SENCO and ask to have a look what that looks like. Okay. So that's just another example. I only put 2 on, but you know, certainly when I've been speaking to some of my older students, they're really worried about what's going to happen at lunchtime, which, you know, if we're all honest, that's the most important part of the day. How does that work? Certainly some of my older students need help in terms of their arm lifting and food being cut up. So the risk is lunchtime in the canteen. What does my dystrophy child, well, they need their food collecting, they need it taken, cut up. And so really what I would do in terms of a risk assessment for a student who has those needs is, could they pre-select from a menu before lunch so they don't have to queue up with everybody else? Could they put in like their order, somebody collects it fully wrapped? Could the food be cut up while the TA is wearing PPE? Could things that they could finger feed be chosen over maybe something like soup, which is going to be more of an issue? So that's the sort of thing that you should be looking for in terms of schools, nursery, colleges. They should be thinking through the individual issues that relate to your child. I've added independence box on the end of mine because I think it's really key, especially when if you've got students that are capable of having a voice, about involving them in the problem solving. Because certainly I've got a couple of students that were key worker students, so they've been back in school already, and they just said, well, look, I'll just take a packed lunch in from home. I know what I can eat. I'll just have the same wrap every day. And they came up with the solution. So again, if you've got children that can contribute, definitely have an element of problem solving on there. Okay. So the risk assessment should outline what the school or setting will be doing in terms of where they sit, how many people work with them, do staff have PPE if they need to be helped with toileting. So you should find all that information in terms of the risk assessment for the school. I'm aware that lots of my students use transport to get to and from school, and that is another huge area of concern, because as a parent for the last few months, you've been in total control about what comes in and out of your house. And then so you think, okay, I've got my head around school, and then suddenly you think about transport and you think, well, how do I control that? Obviously, I'm aware that you come from all across the UK, so I can't talk about individual local authorities. But I would say, certainly from my perspective, we have had key SEN children going to special schools and mainstream schools using transport throughout the last 5 months. And I would say out of every element, in terms of the rules and the legislation, transport was the highest. So at one point during COVID, we only had 2 children, one at the front of the bus, one at the back. Staff had PPE. There was a half-hour turnaround where the bus was cleaned. And certainly within my local authority, we were using admin staff, local authority people who maybe worked on other jobs to come in and be escorts, so that we had more people on the road, so we weren't having to squash people together. Now, when we all go back to school, I don't know what that looks like yet, but certainly in terms of planning as I broke up, they were looking at lots of staggered times. So maybe you get offered a slightly later pickup and a different drop-off time, but it means that there may be only half the number or a third of the number of the students on the bus or the taxi they use. But certainly the rules that we needed to follow in terms of PPE and cleaning were very substantial. But again, if you go to whoever organises your transport, they should be able to give you what their risk assessment is for the journey, and that will help you make your mind up whether you feel that's safe for your child. Any questions around transport? Oh. Okay.
Claire, sorry to interrupt. I do have a question that came in earlier today regarding transport. So it's from one of our families that are actually on with us this evening. Their daughter is 23 and she's a manifesting carrier of Duchenne. She has learning difficulties, has scoliosis and low lung function, as well as mobility restrictions, and she's been on a course of prednisolone for many years. She's due to return to college next month, and although the college have provided them with reassurances about COVID mitigation, they still have some really serious concerns over her overall safety. Yeah. So she usually has county council minibus transport provided, collection from home and return drop-off. But should they discontinue that, as they can't be confident that the 5 to 6 other students in the small bus being COVID-free and the driver, and wearing masks, avoiding any contact, especially during the winter?
Okay, so my first, if I was them, and obviously I'm hoping that you're in the meeting today, but I would first of all go back to the people that organise the transport department and say, you know, this is my child. She doesn't just have learning needs, she has this, you know, suppressed immunity, she's on this medication, this is her overriding profile. Does that change what you can offer me? Because there's a huge amount of planning going on during the summer holidays about groupings, and I think original transport routes and timings will be changed for many local authorities to group different children, less numbers. So you could make the decision that, oh, I'm not going to use the transport at all, but actually I would definitely have the conversation first and say, these are underlying health needs, how can you protect her? And just see what their risk assessment is, because they may have done a huge amount of planning before. They may not, but it's definitely worth having a conversation and saying, you know, if this is her risk, would you be able to, instead of a minibus, be able to provide a taxi, where the taxi driver is forward fronting and then the young person sits at the back. I don't know if the young person's in a wheelchair or not, but again, definitely I would have a conversation before making a decision.
Lovely, thank you very much, Claire.
Okay, all I know is we've had teachers being bus escorts, we've had deputy heads being bus escorts, to just reduce the number of children on a certain bus or a taxi. So I think that will probably continue. Huge number of extra staff being used to escort, but it's definitely worth having a conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, so where you're at, you've had a conversation with the school or college in terms of what can they do. I would definitely ask to see the risk assessment, or, you know, and then that way it will have documented what they're going to do about staffing, handles, lunch times, toileting, and that should begin to help you formulate an idea about what college or school looks like for your children. Transport's a separate decision, but definitely have a conversation. But obviously, if you're still feeling like this and you just don't know which decision to make, which, if I'm honest, I think many of my complex children's parents are still here, because it's all very well and good to say, oh, everybody go back to school. But, you know, if you've worked so hard to protect your child over this period of time, it's very challenging to try and take that leap of faith. Hopefully the school risk assessment will help, but, you know, ultimately you still need to make the decision. So really where you're left is go back to your child's medical team, because they would have seen them last in terms of a checkup, knowing the combination of medication they're on, knowing their health. And certainly for many teams that I was contacting in July, they were saying, you know, they can go back, they can go back, they can go back. Another website that's really useful, and again, I don't know if parents know about this, is the Royal College of Paediatric and Children's Health. And on there, it's basically, they are represented on there with all the paediatric professionals from a variety of disciplines, whether that be genetics or neurology, but they come together as a really strong collective group. And as a professional, when I want clarity over medical advice, I'm not always going to the government website, I'm going here. And what they've come up with a group A and a group B. Group A and B have very clear outlines about which children fit in. And they are saying on this website that, you know, the advice is still to shield if you're in group B. So it's definitely worth having a look. And it isn't as clear cut as saying my child has dystrophy. It's to do with medication, and as you all know, to do with impact on heart. But dystrophy are annotated in those groups, so it's definitely worth having a look. So talk to your medical team saying, you know, we're getting ready to go back in September. Are you happy for that to happen? Look at what your school and college can put in place. And if you're still unsure, have a look at that website. It's well worth a look. Again, I didn't know if people generally, most parents don't generally know about that website. Okay. So if you've decided, yes, they are going to school, if that's where we've got to, you're happy that school are doing everything in their power to keep them safe. I've just formulated some ideas and activities and just general information about what I would be doing in the next week, 10 days as a parent, because it's been a very long time young people haven't been to school. If I'm honest, when I've been doing my welfare checks, most of my students have been happy as Larry. Most parents are on their knees, but most children have chilled. And I've actually had some amazing success stories of some students doing really well while they've been at home, and the pressure of school taken away. So if where we're at the moment is that you've made the decision, yes, they're going back, this is some ideas that I would put in place. So these are general that I would be doing for every child or young person who is going back to school or college. So I would, from now really, is slowly bring home life into some sort of structure. Most of the families I talk to, there isn't, because everybody's just formulated a thing that works for them. So begin to put boundaries around sleep and waking up and routine. Otherwise, when they do go back, it's going to come as a huge, huge shock. Contact the school and ask, has there been a video tour of what the new arrangements look like? Because there are often many new entrances being used, one-way systems, things that you need to do at different positions, as in you need to put your bag here, you need to wash your hands, you need to do that. And it's really useful if your child can able to watch that. I know that teachers are still on holiday, but most people go back and they'll have 2 or 3 days training day. So if they pick up an email from you asking for that, I'm sure if they haven't done it, somebody would run round and put that together quite quickly for you. It's really important that you get from school the names of their teachers or key staff, and even just key students who they're going to be with, because schools are looking at grouping again, and it's really important for you to sort of say to your young students and children that you may not be with that best friend, but you don't know that. So it's really helpful for schools if they can share 1 or 2 people who are going to sit in their bubble, who will be going out to lunch with them in that bubble, because that helps you begin to formulate a connection with the world that you knew. If you're not using transport and you are doing the drop off and pick up, it's really important that, number one, you know where that is, because lots of schools have got very different arrangements. What they don't want is parents grouped outside having a chat. And so some schools are doing different times, different places. So again, it's useful that you know that, but also you can begin to prepare your child that it may not be the same door, the same entrance. Certainly most of my schools have opened every single point of access, and then you're given a different access point. It's really useful to ask the school, could you have a copy of the timetable? And also for most of my students, they're very keen on knowing what the lunch menu is. So if you can't get that online, a physical copy of that just helps you begin to connect. I think some of the worst feeling would be if you go back and you go through the door and you don't know your first lesson, you don't know who that's going to be with, and you don't know where that is. So if you're an older student, I think a timetable is really useful. If you've got a primary age child, ask them to send a visual timetable through as best they can. And then really over the next few days, I would begin to build in some time to talk about school. I personally wouldn't sit down and say, are you worried about going back? Because they'll probably say no. because they're probably still in that zone of it's not going to happen. But I would do something, play a game, do some cooking, do something which means you're alongside, but that's quite often where the chat and the anxiety starts to happen. I'm aware that several children with dystrophy also have ASD, and I've put some links further through the PowerPoint for some really nice social stories, which are really simple about going back post-COVID, but during an unusual time. So I'll show you the link a bit further on, but if you have students who have an ASD type of profile, I will definitely be doing social stories now. You know, on this date, this is where we're going to get up, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, because it has been a really long time, and so it will be different for them. So yes, find a space to have a chat about it, but my experience would be not to ask them directly, because most students who are cognitively able will normally look towards a parent or carer's face to register if there's any anxiety. So if you're quite blasé about it, they will generally be that way. So if you keep saying, are you worried, then slowly they think there must be something to worry about. Equally, we can have some students who have an underlying issue with anxiety, and that's why I would definitely start now. And generally just talk about school, who's been there, which teachers have left, to see what you can find out from a newsletter or a website. Just see if you can find out any gossip from other mums, useful. So that's what I would do for any child. I think if you were looking at a child or student who has additional needs, I would be looking around if we've got any, I don't know if we've got any school staff on the webinar tonight, but I would almost be looking as if our SEN student is just starting for the first time. So you're explaining everything again. This is where this is what happens, this is your buddy, this person's going to be with you, because it's been a really long time. I think if you can get photos or information from teachers and TAs, that's really handy. Certainly some of mine, if we know the students are anxious, they've booked in a quarter-an-hour video chat during the training days when we go back next week. Some of them are pre-recorded, you know, hello, I'm Mr. So-and-so and I'm your teacher and this is the classroom, and email that. That's really helpful. Again, social stories, always useful. And it may be worth going on the school website. Every website will have a section that says rules, because during this time, schools have got more rules, because it's, you know, you can only go one way, you can only go this way, you can only bring certain amount of kit into school and it needs to look like that. You may not be able to take your favourite pencil case. So maybe it might be worth this stage of this next 10 days of you going on the website and just seeing what you can find out about the changes, because there have been a huge number of changes about what you can take to and from school. And also just begin to talk to your child or young person about something in September they may like to do that's out and about that isn't school, because I'm beginning to hear from a couple of my older students that I've worked with. They've said, look, I've been really good with shielding and actually I've been fine. Now I've got to go back to school, but nobody's talking about going to the seaside or, you know, going and watching horse riding or something that they would have done before. And so they see it that they've come out of lockdown, but the only sort of opportunity is to go to school. And so lots of people are beginning to say, could you just try and look at one, you know, even if it's like a takeaway or a trip somewhere to see somebody, something else for them to look forward to. And then really, this is probably my key message to all parents and carers, is basically just model coping. And you've all done the most amazing job. There's somebody with the most amazing hair, how to cope. Because in reality, all your young people will have questions that you won't know the answer to. And even if you phone school, they might not know the answer to. So you need to sort of begin to share with them, actually, I don't know. I'll try and find out the information, but actually I may have to put you on the bus and we still don't know about that precise thing. And that's different, because normally mum, dad, carers normally can get to the bottom of most things. During COVID, I'm afraid there's been several questions where we just say we're going to have to see. To try and model that resilience, because lots of children will watch your reaction. If you're running around the kitchen going, I don't know what that's going to look like, then obviously that escalates anxiety. And then I would be very mindful then the first couple of weeks, if they go back to school and college, they are going to be exhausted just from noise, sensory information, overload, directed time, because you know, all of us, adults and children, have been to some extent on our own time. We've been doing our own thing, and suddenly to be told to listen, to look, to be somewhere is going to be quite challenging. So just be aware that you might be receiving a very grumpy child home who's tired, and it may not be because the COVID thing's been difficult, it just may be that they're exhausted. But try and build in some sort of debrief time. I used to be a foster carer, and I used to care for young people who had disabilities, and they'd normally tell me most of the stuff during bath time. That was when most of the things used to come out, was during bath time generally. But you'll have your own times individually where your children will try and share what's going on. So just bear that in mind, that they may well be fully exhausted. And then this is really around where I would feel that I would need to step this up and give a SENCO, or whether that be a school or college, a bit of a heads up if any of these apply to your family. So if your child is already expressing high anxiety, please send an email now so that somebody picks it up and begins to make a more robust plan. Don't wait till the first day and that you drop them off saying, oh, they've been in a real state about this. Give school a heads up. You may not get a response, but people will be thinking about how to formulate a plan. Be honest. If you've just not done much of the work that's gone home, been sent home, it doesn't matter. We're going to have young people who don't have any needs coming back to school who've done nothing. We're going to have young people who don't have any needs, who've been on a 12-hour military campaign with their parents to get them 5 grades higher. And we're going to have a whole range of children in between. So if you couldn't get your child to do the maths homework, or they had a complete meltdown about something being sent home, just be honest, because it will give the class teachers a heads up with where to start and fill those gaps. Nobody's going to judge you. I would rather know as a teacher where I'm starting from, instead of thinking, well, I sent all that home, it was all being done. Also, if there's been any changes over the last few months, particularly behavioural or emotional, so if there's certain ways that young people like something to be done, or if there's certain triggers that lead to a meltdown, can you give the school a heads up? Again, nobody's going to judge you, but people would rather know before they come through the door. And then I think this applies to every single family that have had children at home for the last 5 months, is there will be massive attachment issues for them missing you, and probably more likely you missing them. I'm just looking at Sam, because Sam and I have known each other a really long time.
I'm smiling so much. I definitely have those issues.
Yeah. But you will. Much as you'll want him to go back, you won't know what to do with yourself for the first few hours. Well, I don't know, maybe not. But just, again, acknowledge that this could happen, and it will happen, and it's going to happen to lots of families across the country, let alone families who've been shielding. So be kind to yourself. Just accept that it will happen. Again, if your family has experienced any loss or trauma during COVID, again, if you give the schools a heads up, every school in the country have been working really hard since June to put together huge emotional and trauma packages for children at all different levels. So again, if you've had a bereavement, or your young person's witnessed a trauma related to extended family, please tell the school, because they're formulating groups with psychologists, and there's a huge amount of money and resources going into school. So please tell them. And also, it's about trying to work out how you get hold of somebody if you've got a problem. So you may have had your historical route where you dropped somebody an email, or you phoned the school and somebody was able to give you a quick ring back. At the moment, when we go back, staff are working in bubbles and they're working in protected areas. So whilst you will have SENCOs looking after your children, they may not be as available as they were, or only on certain days. So again, it may be worth establishing, if you're a parent who's going to be anxious about how they are, can you just drop them a line and say, okay, moving forward, if I've got a problem or I want to know how my child is, how do I contact you? And it may be that it's a school office person that they go to the setting, find out, and they phone you back. Because at the moment, they're trying to stop a huge number of children going and staff going between different rooms. So just bear that in mind. And then if you do get a reply from school towards the end of the holiday, it may be really helpful if you could just get a heads up about what's going to come up in September. So if they're studying the Romans, or they're going to do this book or this story, it would just be useful. You can begin, you don't have to buy it, you don't have to look it up, but you may just begin to talk about that with your child. So these books are a range of ages. The one in the middle, The Invisible String, is really good for children who are anxious about being away from you. I might have to buy Sam a copy, because Jude doesn't need it, but Sam may. So it may, you know, it's a really nice way about staying connected with a family member. If you have got a child who's an anxious child anyway, the best book that I would recommend for parents is this book called Starving the Anxiety Gremlin. You can buy that on Amazon, or W.H. Smith's have it. And that's really useful. And it's a behavioural approach, but it's a really good way of acknowledging being anxious. And there's a whole range of ages. So if your child's older than this, there's older versions of it. Another really nice book is This Huge Bag of Worries. So they're the 3 books for different ages that I would recommend. If you've got a teenager, then I would look at something like a journaling approach, get them to get down. So again, if fine motor's a problem, they can do it online. A journal approach or an app is quite useful to voice record what are issues. If fine motor is still okay, then a journaling method is quite useful. If we've got any professionals with schools on the webinar tonight, then this useful book is really useful. But as parents, it's a really good book as well. It's about taking issues that you're worried about and picking out positives and negatives and balancing it up. A practical thing quite a lot of my students have liked are these worry people. You can buy them on eBay for £3. I think Amazon might sell them as well. And basically, before you go to bed, you put one in the bag, and each one you give a worry to. And then you put it in the bag, and then you tie it up, and then you put your worry bag under your pillow. I do have a huge amount of young men on my caseload, way more than girls, and we have a different version that's like a washing powder bag and lots of Lego men, and each one's a different emotion. So it's tired, cross, hungry, in pain, fed up, hate my mum, don't like my dad, a whole range of emotions. But it may be worth creating something for your own home. But you talk through what the issues are, you put them, and then you tie a knot and you hide it. The best website that I could find today when I was putting this together, there's an amazing educational psychologist website here, EM Ed Support, and they have the most enormous amount of resources around going back to school during COVID, SEN, anxiety, just issues about being angry about having to go back. I'd rather stay at home. So that's the best psychological approach that I can find. All the resources on there are free and you can download them. In the bottom right hand corner, you've got something that's got 5 colours, and it's called the Incredible 5-point scale, and we use that primarily with children with autism. And you have, 1 where everything's going well, 2's okay, 3 I'm really not very happy, 4, and then 5 is a complete meltdown and the world's come to an end. And it's about taking that idea and having a scale of where are you. So they might be getting really cross or really upset and they can't find the words or can't even acknowledge why they're upset or they're angry. And it's about beginning to use a scale. Where are you? Are you a 3? Are you a 5? Where are you? And then normally once you have the different scales, you then talk about things that help you calm down. So it may be that you just want to be left alone for 10 minutes. It may be that you want to watch a video. It may be that you have something to eat. And so you have strategies that are personal to you, but it's a really good idea in terms of scale. Where are you? Particularly when we have children that generally go from 1 to 5 very quickly and you can't work out what's happened. Okay. So they're the sort of, from an emotional point of view, the resources that I would use. I didn't really know how to represent this, but I'm sure when you talk to your schools, they will talk very clearly around what PPE looks like in the school, what it will look like for the TA that's helping your child. And you need to ask those questions. What does that look like? But I spoke to Sam earlier in the day about today, and I was thinking, actually, if I was you and I was a parent, I probably want to enable my child. So you can buy these little sanitizers that clip on, that could clip on their tray or clip on their chair. And I personally, as a mum, would probably have a sign that says, can you please sanitize your hands, or can you please, wash your hands before you work with me? I'm not saying that your setting won't provide it, but there's always the situation where somebody will suddenly take a young person to lunch and they haven't got the stuff with them. So I'm not saying that you need to buy PPE, but I would, as a parent, if it was me, I would buy a small amount. The clip-on ones, I know you can buy in Poundland, so they're not very expensive. But it's also about, if you have your children have a voice and are able to speak, then it's about making sure before they go back to school, they have a mantra: have you washed your hands? So they know to ask whoever's helping them, can you clean the table? And just empower them without scaring them, really. These are some final sort of resources. The website SEN Resource Blog is one of the best. It's added to daily, but they have a really nice section, which was probably the place where I could find it all in one place for you. And they have a huge amount of resources about returning to school after lockdown. So they have some social stories, they have some visual ways. I really like this idea of a worry ladder, about positioning your worries, about then what would you do about it. If you have children who like to hold something concrete, these worry monsters at the moment, they're selling them in the works and you can buy them online. They're about £5. But again, they work the same way as the dolls in that you'd write their worry and they feed them in the mouth and then you zip them up. But again, lots of our young people like something to hold. And then if you do have students that have and children that have normally had quite high levels of mental health support from maybe CAMS, or just if you're generally interested about CAMS type support, this is a really good website for families. It's called mentalhealth.org, and they've got loads of resources you can download. So if you get to the night before and your child has a complete meltdown, you think, I don't know what to do, there's so much that you can download if you think you need it. So they're the sites, those 2 sites are the ones that I would recommend. This is another really good site for general family life, because I'm focusing about our dystrophy children going back to school and college, but you know, for many of our families, they will have brothers and sisters that may not want to go back either. And there will be a whole load of rules that need to be re-established about bedtime and homework and doing as you're told. And they too have had this long period without being at school. So again, if you have issues with siblings around rules, routines, this is probably the best site that I would recommend. Again, you have loads of things you can download, charts and things that you can personalise for your family. I think it was at the end of July, the government gave nationally a huge pot of money to support families. And I'm a big advocate for Barnardo's, mainly because Barnardo's are based in Redbridge, so I know of their work really well. Now, the government funded project that relates to COVID and post-COVID is called See, Hear, Respond. So if you Google Barnardo's and then put See, Hear, Respond, the government have given Barnardo's a huge pot of money for things like counselling, sibling support, a whole range of support for families. And it's only really just getting up and going. So I looked today, you can refer yourself as a family. So don't be scared, because it will have also sort of, you know, if you're worried about a child, call 999. We're not saying that. If you go onto the parent section, there's an SEN box, drop on there, and it's about coping with being through lockdown and the things that we've been talking about. And they are direct support through therapists and also direct family support as well for siblings and young people with special needs. And they nearly always do it separate. The siblings have their own time and the young person with special needs have their own time as well. So it's a UK-wide project, and I think it's going to be publicly promoted as soon as we go back to school. So if you're interested, look now before the world jumps on and refers themselves. But yeah, you don't have to have a social worker, you just have to have a child with special needs to be able to refer yourself. Okay. So we've talked a little bit, well, you know, it depends on your perspective, but we've talked quite a lot about if you want you've made the decision for them to go back to school. You've got the risk assessment information, you've possibly got your transport information, and you've got a toolkit of resources if you're suddenly very anxious or your child's very anxious. The bad news is that that's only a snapshot of that week or that day. So a risk assessment is revisited all the time. So if the COVID rate in your area goes up, then the risk assessment has to be re-looked at the school. So it could be that they can do this and this and this while the R rate is low in your area and your child can go to school or college, that's fine. As soon as the R rate rises, the risk assessments have to be looked at again. So you have to bear in mind, for us all of us who have young people who have medical needs, that this is a very fluid situation. So they could go back and it can be fine. But if in your area or your locality, like Birmingham's just recently gone over the threshold, then it may be that the judgment is for them to be back home again. So you need to also, right from day one, be talking to the school and saying, okay, in 2 weeks' time, if suddenly my child is coming home again for a 2 or 3 week lockdown because the R rate is too high, what does that look like? I can't be doing the baking and the bits and pieces anymore. How do they access school? How are they accessing an education? Is there a remote system going to be set up? Is there going to be a camera set up? How can I access therapy, etc.? Because you could be back in lockdown for no fault of your own, just simply the locality means that it's too risky for your child to go to school. So it's really important to have those conversations now while things are relatively quiet in most areas before it happens, so that schools need to be reminded they need to have a plan B if your child's at home. Okay, and this is probably going to sound really patronising, but this was in the news today. And everybody's talked about this massive global impact on mental health for young people during pandemic. There's been some research, it's only initial research, and it's only linked to teenage years. But basically, the research has not shown what we expected as professionals. The rates of anxieties for the majority of teenagers who didn't have an underlying mental health issue is they have significantly dropped during lockdown, because they haven't got the social interaction at school, they haven't got the rules, the routine. Many of them have found a new way of learning. They've learned through YouTube, or they've done their studying at 10 o'clock at night. But the research has only been launched today, and it's not really what we thought, in that you've obviously all done a cracking job, because generally the feedback for young people is they've loved being at home. I think the biggest challenge is going to be we can't get them back to school, because they probably don't want to go from home back to school. But it's really, really not what we were expecting. Which is, I mean, it's what I was hearing when I was phoning up and speaking to my students. They're like, oh, miss, it's lovely. You know, I don't start work till about 1, but I get my work done, you know. And I think particularly children who maybe have an ASD element, who struggle with friendships, have found studying and being at home more relaxing. So you've done a great job. Nationally, parents have done a really good job. I think our work now is around the next 10 days, 2 weeks, about you finding out the information so that you can make an informed decision about your young person, whether they should go back, what that looks like, how that works. And then you've got a toolkit around things like anxiety, if that happens. We, in my local authority, which is a London borough, we did a programme throughout the summer term with every single year 6 student who had an EHC, and we had weekly contact like this. So it started off 1-to-1, and then we paired them up with somebody, then we paired them up till we had a group of 6, so that they all knew at least 6 people going to their new secondary school. And we prepared resources on bullying, being anxious, all the things we think about are flashpoints for transitioning to secondary school. And we had this huge bank. And when we actually analysed who wanted or needed those at the end of, I think we had nearly 450 children moving to secondary school with an EHC, and only 10% wanted or needed those resources. So we'd looked almost for more trouble than where they were. I'm quite excited. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm only signposting you to the things that I've just shown if you need them. Don't assume you will, because your young person might be quite happy to go back to school or college. So this is really what teachers are going to be facing at the end of next week. We are generally going to have students who've been in one of 2 camps. One who's probably, I'm looking at teenagers now at the moment, but one who's probably been gaming and watching movies and having a whale of a time. And then one who has just studied and mum's bought extra books and they've had extra tasks. And we'll have all the children that fit somewhere in the middle. Certainly when we were looking at April, we had a whole spectrum of students doing a bit of this and a bit of that. By July, if I'm honest, the majority of phone calls I had, families had either just given up and were letting them do their own thing, or doing family type things, and we were surviving, but everybody was happy. Or we had parents that were very, very driven still on academic studying, etc. So teachers will have, even if you didn't have any special needs or any medical needs, we will have these 2 polarised groups coming back into school. So if your child fits in one or the other, it doesn't matter. Or if they fit in the middle, it doesn't matter. The teacher's job really, at the moment, we are looking at what's called a recovery curriculum for nearly 6 months, because everybody left on a similar level within a year group, or we knew where they were. And what we've got coming back, we will have some children that are 3 years ahead, and we'll have some children that are a year and a half behind. And somehow over the next 6 months, we've got to get everybody back to a similar level. But a lot of that work will be around emotional well-being. So it won't go straight back into, you know, get this piece of work done, because we need to pick everybody up as a group. So that's for every child. That's not just because your child's got additional needs. And again, if you have the decision where you feel your child can't go back to school, you need to be asking those questions. Well, how does my child be part of that activity within school? How do they access those lessons? So is it on Zoom? Is it on video link, etc.? Because again, the numbers that will be at home are actually very, very small we're looking at. So I'm looking at, in terms of my cohort, I've got children who've got tracheostomies, I've got children who have BiPAP during the day, and they're not going back till December at the earliest. So I've probably only got about 3% of my caseload who are not going back. So it's a very small percentage to make these individual arrangements for. So it's not a big job, but you just need to make sure your local authority know if that's the position you find yourself in, not just your school, because it's our responsibility as an authority to put a plan together for them if it's a medical reason why they're not going back to school. If you just choose to keep them at home and the doctors say they can go back, you'll be classed as you've chosen to home educate your child, and then the education is completely up to you. Okay, so I mean, most people, I wouldn't advise, but unless you were home educating before, I wouldn't advise you to do that. So I would advise you to talk to your local authority, because they will then give you the resources and the manpower to help you do it. Okay, so after all of this, I'm not quite sure which camp your child's in, or as mum and dad, which camp you're in. You could be in either, but hopefully some of the things that we've talked about tonight have at least clarified the responsibility of schools and colleges, and also what will go on around your young person. But from a practitioner's point of view, you know, we could have to revisit that risk assessment every 2 or 3 days and look all the time to make sure they're safe. And then if it's a good practice, it should be in conjunction with you as parents, if there's any change. Okay, so I am basically directing this towards Sam as a mum who I've worked with for many, many years. But make sure over the next few days that if you are sending them back to college and school, you start talking about what you're going to be doing on that day. Whether that's meeting a friend for a coffee, whether that's going to buy a new pair of shoes, whether it's running around a golf course. I don't mind, but you need to make sure that your child knows that you've got somewhere else to be as well. Because when you talk to young people, they often say, oh, well, you know, mum was sad or dad was sad, so I stayed with them. In normal situations, let alone this one. So make sure you get a calendar and you start talking about where you might be and what you're going to do. And I'm looking at Sam because I'm aware she's also on leave during that time. So that's sort of a collection of my ideas and information. I'm going to put the screen down, and if anybody's any questions, I will do my best to answer.
Claire, I do have a few questions, if that's okay. I'll start off. Another one from the family that I spoke to you about earlier. They were just wondering, how can they ensure that their daughter does not risk exposure to COVID-19 whilst attending college? Wearing a mask is one thing, but throughout the day she would be constantly handling and adjusting it. So her hands and her carer's hands would frequently be near her face. And what about door handles, keyboards, handrails, wheelchair arms, etc.?
Okay, so is that young person at college, not at school?
It is.
Okay.
She is. She's 23, going to college.
Okay, so she's at college. So in terms of door handles, keyboards, all of those things, that goes back to my original point about seeing the risk assessment. Lots of schools, lessons are 2/3 of the time. Lots of colleges, lessons are 2/3 of the time, because there is cleaning built in. So every time the whole class leaves, everything will be cleaned. If the young lady has a TA, then it would be on the risk assessment what the cleaning protocol is. So it would be before she touches anything. The majority of students that I work with, if I'm honest, are not going to tolerate a mask. They may tolerate a mask on a bus, but it's our job as practitioners to protect them from us, I think, rather than expect. You know, I've got lots of students who've got behaviour problems, short attention, really short attention, and if they're going to have a mask to fiddle with, that's going to become the focus. So for me, if I was that young lady's parents, I'd be talking to the college and saying, what does that look like? Will the TA or whoever's working with her have a visor? Will there be sanitizers? So what's the cleaning protocol? And that's why I showed the risk assessment at the beginning, because that should all be captured on there, and it should be individual for their daughter. So it's not a global one for the college. It's one that will be written for her. And if it hasn't been written, then they will need to write one to share with the family, really. I don't know if the family are on tonight, whether that answers the question, but...
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Claire. And we've had another one from a young lady whose son's refusing to go back to school, and it's not Jude. It's not Jude, just letting that out there right now. It's not Jude.
Well, Jude would know that I'd probably come round and get him, wouldn't he?
Oh, I'd drop him to you, Claire. Be no problem at all. So their child is refusing to go back to school, and it's sort of a two-part question. So that's the first part. And actually, how would you suggest to deal with overwhelm, actually, for him being overwhelmed when he does go back to school, because he is going to go back to school?
And do we know how old the child is and if they have any learning needs?
Yes, he's 14, and he has also has ADHD, ASD and ODD.
In special school or mainstream?
Special.
Okay. I'd be telling the school, dropping them an email, even if you don't get a reply straight away. We are going to have a whole range of children who don't have needs, who won't go out of the door. This is going to happen. We have plans for this not happening. And what we need to see is who gets back through the door in one piece. And then, but a heads up in the middle of August would be much better than the start day where you can't get him on the transport or on the bus. I would be giving the school a heads up. And then certainly, I mean, my background, special school, if he was in my class, I'd come home. I don't think a video is probably going to cut it if he's not interested in going back. He's probably not interested because he's done things that have kept him well, happy, on his own agenda. And school, you know, it's been such a long time for some of these young people, particularly if they've got learning needs. You know, I've got a daughter who's 18 who's just finished her A-levels, and actually when we got to the A-level results, she couldn't care less, and I was really surprised. And she said, it's been so long since I was in school, I've almost forgotten what being in school's like. And that's a young lady that has a range of health needs but doesn't have any learning needs, and she just couldn't. And most of her friends were similar, and most of them were a bit like, well, I don't even know if I'm going to do uni or college, because they haven't studied for so long. So if we look at this young man who's got a range of multiple needs, it's no wonder that doesn't really have any appeal if home is fun, safe. Again, whoever their mum is, they've obviously done a too good job, really. No, I'm only joking. But I would tell school, I would give them a heads up now. And, you know, they might not respond because they might not want to get in a dialogue during the holidays, but they will read, you know, all teachers are reading their emails, and they will formulate a plan with you. And I'm sure you'll have a phone call. But, you know, if it was me, and I have taught in a special school for many years, I would probably arrange a time to come home and slowly begin a transition. Because actually, for that young man, probably the concept of school is so abstract now. He's probably going to need to see his favourite teacher or his favourite TA or something that connects him with school. But I would give the school a heads up. Lovely. I don't think a video tour is probably going to cut it if that young man has other needs. It won't hurt, but I don't think it's probably going to get him on the bus.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm just looking at everybody now, and I know that you're all on mute, but if you want to come off and ask any questions yourself, please feel free to do so. You don't have to type it into the box. So.
Yeah, I'll try once I get this going. Sorry. Thanks for the information. You mentioned at the start of it, you were talking about the UK government guidelines. We live in Wales. We've got a different set of guidelines for shielding, etc. Are you aware of any major differences between the local authority guidelines here and what they are in England?
No, other than they're more robust about lockdowns again. So exactly the same things apply in terms of risk assessment, but their threshold, as you and I know, for what they close down is less. So it would take less for that to happen again.
Right. Because I've got concerns that basically my boy is 14, he'll be 15 next week.
See the young man I see with the wonderful hair? Hello.
He is, he's very concerned about going to school, and I'm quite concerned as well. Basically because we've had issues with any kind of funding or anything. If we have to go to the local authority to actually argue a case of why he's staying home or why the school's risk assessments are not up to scratch, I don't feel we're going to get anywhere. Do you know of any recourse after the local authorities? Or is it that's the end of the line, essentially?
Well, I mean, I think there is this, I mean, I think the comment about everybody needs to be back, shielding's over, is probably caused a great deal of anxiety for lots of my families, because it isn't quite that cut and dried. So if you go on the link I showed you about the Royal College of Pediatric Doctors, go on there, and it's really clear cut. And if you try and look in terms of what your son's medication and where he is, there are really, really clear guidelines on there. If I'm really on, I can't speak for your son's school, but you know, teachers on the first week are going to have their back against the wall. They're going to have kids who don't want to come, kids who are anxious, kids who have got special needs who are not used to a regime. I don't know of any school, if a family said the first 2 or 3 weeks, I'm just going to see how this goes, I'm not going to send them back, I'm getting further guidance from my medical team, I do not know of any school in the first few weeks who would challenge that. The conversation you need to do is about your young man is entitled to an education and how does he access that while you're getting that information. So no, I don't think there is this immediate rush to people being in trouble, fines, because it's not an exact science. And you know, all schools in their risk assessment will be led by your medical team as well. So if your medical team says he needs this, this and this in place, you go to school who says, is he go to mainstream school?
Yeah.
They may say, I can't do that. I can't guarantee that all of that can be put in place, and then the risk assessment would be he has to be at home.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you then say, well, how does he get an education? How do I access that direct teaching and learning? Because I'm now here through no fault of his own. It's just the needs and the risk is too great at this moment.
Yeah, that's what I envisage happening. But yeah, thank you very much anyway.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Sam has my contact details. If I can help anywhere, just give me a shout.
I might do that. Thank you very much.
Okay. But again, I generally, I'm aware, you know, I work nationally. I'm a PD ambassador, and schools have worked all through the summer trying to put plans in place. So I would imagine if you've got really complicated students who we're not sure about yet, because we haven't got written from a consultant, this can happen, and they can't immediately accommodate all those lists of needs, you know, I mean, we're talking about probably, my caseload is just medical and physical children, and I'm only talking about 3 to 5% not going back. And that's sort of tracheostomy, dystrophy, atrophy children. Everybody else, I've got a young man who's awaiting a heart and lung transplant, and the consultant has said he's to go back.
Yeah, so in this, I don't want to talk about the individual circumstance, but it is basically, I don't feel they could cope with his needs as it is now. Even though he's in a mainstream and it's a new school, there is a special unit there.
I'm with you.
The local authority feels they fund the special unit, so there is no funding or help for mainstream.
I understand.
Students.
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
So that's the issue.
But COVID is different, and that's why you need to ask to see the risk assessment. because you'd be saying, what about this? What about this scenario? What about this need? So it's very different times. It's in addition to where, you know, I've got families that have concerns about capacity for supporting needs, but COVID is about individual risks for individual children. And that would be
you mentioned about review of risk assessments.
Yeah.
Do you recommend that that's done on a regular basis, or as things change?
Yeah, I mean, schools would do it weekly anyway for complex children, but if your R rate in your area changed during that week, it would have to be done overnight.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, we've been pretty lucky down here anyway. So.
Yeah, no, you're in.
Okay.
But again, I would very strongly recommend you ask to see the risk assessment, because that will give you really clear, well, what can they do? Brilliant. And then, yeah, and again, go back to your medical team and say, well, look, this is what they say they can do. And the medical team may say that's not enough. But you need to make sure you then have the dialogue about how does your young man have his education, because he's entitled to that. You know, most of us everybody, the advice was we just sort of survived for the last few months. And now it's really about how do our students maintain an education now.
Well, he's been pretty good at that. So he's a pretty busy son.
You're hard taskmaster.
No, not really. He was so bored some days. He just wanted to do it.
Yeah, that did happen, actually. There was a circle. Yeah.
There's only so much FIFA and Netflix you can watch, I think.
I think most people have exhausted Netflix, haven't they?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Does anyone else have any questions? Nisha, I'm looking at you. Oh, you've said no. Okay. And Claire, I don't think we have any more questions. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I've written so many notes. It was just wonderful. Thank you so much.
I can just see Nisha. She's taken a mic off. I don't know. She's saying goodbye.
Thank you. Actually, my son's looking forward to going back.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, when I shared the things about anxiety and not wanting to go back, you know, if nobody's showing any anxiety, just bank those. If you don't mention trouble.
None. Yeah.
I mean, you know, where Sam's son is in one of my schools that has a union, and we have 40 odd children that have major significant physical needs, you know, and the provision will be really good. So I wouldn't at the moment, because they're very geared up, because they've got a big group of students who've got quite complex needs, dystrophy not being the most significant by any means. So, but there'll be other schools where maybe you're the only child with that complex level of needs, and it may be more challenging. And that's why, you know, I know it's a bit boring because I sort of talked about a risk assessment, but it has to be done on those individual settings, what they can offer you. You can't just say there's a template that's what they must do.
No.
And school staff are really trying to come to terms with how many staff are going to walk back through the door, because quite a lot of TAs, some teachers of certain ages are saying the risk is too great. So we have to look at what workforce we have in September and then where to put them. But there's lots of plans in place about, you know, teachers moving, children not moving classrooms, you know, people not moving around. So you very much sit with your group, whatever, you know, if you're in a special school, that would probably be a group of 5 or 6. If you're in a mainstream school, that would be your class. Yeah. So yeah, there's lots of planning going on. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming online tonight, and thank you so much, Claire. It was just amazing. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay.
See you later, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.